Well, I am thrilled to be here, and thrilled that Patrick's brother welcomed me so warmly. And as I was talking with my panelists earlier, I shared one of the reasons that I am so excited about being part of this conversation broadly, and particularly this conversation this morning, is that the Alliance for Healthier Generation, which is the partnership between the Clinton Foundation and the American Heart Association, is now the largest childhood obesity program in the country. We work every day in more than 19,000 schools, touching more than 11.5 million kids' lives. And many of the kids who are in our program are already diabetic, are terribly obese, and have lots of mental health challenges that go along with those struggles. And so when my father called the American Heart Association after he had his quadruple heart bypass and said, what can I do to make a difference in heart health? And they said, help us fight childhood obesity, which in 2005 was not an expected answer, although it's now clearly recognized as a challenge. We had no idea that that also would be an entry into helping deal with childhood mental illness. And so we're trying very much to figure out what our responsibility is, how can we make a disproportionate difference, a disproportionate kind of positive difference in the capacity of the schools that we work with, and clearly in the children's lives that we are privileged to touch and engage with every day. So that's what's brought me into this room today. I'm really excited about our panel, and I'm really excited that we're going to start with a history lesson, because history is one of my favorite subjects, and I think context is important. And so before we engage in the discussion this morning, I want to ask Steve to give us a bit of a perspective of how we all wound up in this room today, and not only kind of about the last 50 years, but where you think we should be going, given that history, into the future. So, Steve.
Well, thank you. That's quite a tall order.
And in only 10 minutes.
Okay, well, you know that care for the seriously mentally ill for 100 years was in large institutions, asylums. In the 19th century, after the wonderful crusader Dorothea Dix identified the large numbers of individuals who could benefit from more humane approaches than putting people in jails and prisons and being homeless. What else is new? But she went out and found these people and became a champion for the insane, as she put it, and began these approaches that had the concept, the basic concept, that people with mental illness didn't belong in the community. They needed to have a different experience in the rural asylums, away from their families, and that became, over the course of half a century, an excuse as states began to provide the funds to move people from community settings into large institutions. So they became the repository of folks who literally spent their entire lives in these distant institutions. And that became a scandal in the 1940s, the shame of the states. A number of individuals became Dorothea Dix again, finding these people in very shameful conditions, and began a movement that culminated in the passage of the Community Mental Health Centers Act in 1963. In the Eisenhower administration, and Eisenhower actually was a very interesting president in terms of his interest and activism around this issue, and I think his World War II experience, as Howard Goldman pointed out, was probably part of that. Started this mental health commission on mental health and illness. It was a 5-year study. Action for Mental Health came out in 1961. They did have a major recommendation to improve state hospitals, but the other recommendations focused on trying to provide alternatives in the community. And the 1963 Act was a bold new approach with its basic idea that we needed to provide care for people close to where they live and work, not in faraway institutions, that would be the most important healing impact of bringing people back home, bringing people out of the institutions, but also providing early intervention and prevention in communities, where people would spend their lives rather than in institutions. One of the basic concepts of the 1963 Act and its amendments in 1965 was the catchment area concept, public health approach. The idea was that there were going to be 1,500 of these centers funded initially with federal funds on a declining basis over 8 years in 1,500 areas, and they would be, these areas would be from a small population of 75,000 up to, but not to exceed, 200,000. And the geographic concept of community was very much a part of the 1963 Act. A public health concept, that these centers would be responsible for all the mental health needs in that particular geographic area. Funds were appropriated for construction grants and then staffing grants in many of these areas. By the time the Community Mental Health Centers Act expired in 1981, when Ronald Reagan repealed the Mental Health Systems Act, there were about half the country was covered. So you could say the glass was half empty or half full, but that's what happened. In addition, they were one of the definitions of a community mental health center were essential services. What were the essential services? And there were initially 5 essential services, and then over the course of 10 years, the 5 became 12 essential services. As more and more services were required in order for programs to receive a federal grant, the monies were always in a question mark in the Congress, and so as the program became loaded with requirements, it became more and more difficult to initiate these new community programs. In addition, the community mental health centers had another concept of community, which was somewhat radical and kind of predicting the OEO work in the Johnson administration. Each of these programs had to have community boards, community advisory boards or community governing boards. And that was a radical idea, that people from the community would come and they would help set the priorities for these various programs. Now, one of the criticisms of the Community Mental Health Centers program, and I think it's a good one, is that they were not adequate for the task of taking care of the large numbers of individuals being discharged out of the public institutions. The reason for the discharge mostly was actually money. It was Medicare and Medicaid and other programs over in the 60s and 70s when the states figured out that they could move people out of their expense in the state hospitals and into the federal expense through other kinds of funding. But the hope was, and the expectation was, that these mental health centers would take care of them, and they were not adequate to the task, with some exceptions. But that certainly is, I think, a very legitimate criticism. So many people then ended up, as we know, homeless in jails and prisons. We need another Dorothea Dix to become a champion for these folks that we find now in all of our cities and in the countryside throughout this, throughout the country. But the community advisory boards, to some extent, shifted the priorities of the mental health centers toward prevention, toward the less ill, and so that is something which I think we have to understand and deal with. I'll tell you a personal story. I trained in a federally funded community mental health center in Boston called the Massachusetts Mental Health Center. It was a state hospital and a federally funded community mental health center. We had a catchment area, and we took care of everybody, all the problems in that area. It was a great program, very well funded by the state because it was the major teaching program for the Harvard Medical School in psychiatry and child psychiatry. I had the opportunity to work in a community health center, which was in the Mass Mental catchment area, and to work with the community board. And when I met with the community board, and it was very representative of that neighborhood in Jamaica Plain, I asked, well, we're going to set up a mental health service. What would you like me to take care of in this community? And one person raised their hand and said, well, I've been a community resident for years, and I cannot believe the bad language the kids are using in the street. I want you to take care of that. That's, if you can clean up this foul language that I hear every single day in the street, that's what I would, hope you could take care of. I'm scratching my head and saying, okay, I really want to be responsive to the community need. What am I going to do about that? Now, it turned out one of the young residents who was working with me had been a second-team All-American basketball player. So I said to him, you have you have to spend some time with me. I want you to spend 2 nights a week playing basketball with the kids. And I want you to see what you can do to kind of, what you can do about this kind of problem. And he did that, and he loved it. I mean, this was his thing. I mean, the kids, who is this shrink coming? Oh boy, he can play basketball. And so he engaged the kids, and it was, I think, a good learning experience for him. And I was doing something according to what the community board wanted. But what this young psychiatrist was not doing was seeing the seriously mentally ill who'd been discharged from the hospital. So I think these are the kinds of questions around community. What we didn't do, and what is now, the opportunity. I mean, obviously, in '63, and then for a large number of years, we didn't have the internet. We didn't have the capacity to define communities differently. And I think you'll hear from the rest of the panel different ways of thinking about community when it comes to providing a variety of mental health services, but also prevention. We didn't have very well articulated the concept of peer support. The recovery idea was, it was there, but it wasn't really explicit. Many of these ideas are ideas that are much more of the current era. And where we need to go is possibly come back to the catchment area concept, the public health concept, because I'm very enamored of public health. It tells us what to do from a prevention expectation, and I'm talking about tertiary prevention, not just primary prevention, how we can help people remain in the community, close to where they live and work, capturing the vision for President Kennedy, so that they can have a life in the community. That's what has made the big difference. And I do think the '63 Act was very positive in providing the hope for many families. I ask myself the question, and I'll end with this. If someone becomes seriously ill with a psychosis early in life today, compared to 1962, do they have a better opportunity for recovery? And the answer is yes, absolutely. And it's not only the technologies that we have, the medications and the psychosocial treatments that we have, but it's the basic belief that people deserve an opportunity to live and work close, in the community. They don't need to be put away, which was the policy for 100 years. I'll stop at this point.
Thank you. A.T., you are somewhat in the business, though, of putting people away. And I think it would be interesting to hear your reflections on how you think of community, both within your facilities of incarceration and then also how you think about community for the people who, most of whom will get out at some point. And kind of what do you think is sort of your responsibility? What do you think is the state or the federal government's responsibility? What do you think is the responsibility of community organizations, of families, in ensuring that there is a supportive community for each of your inmates today and when they're no longer under your roof?
Thank you, Chelsea. It is, of course, well known that the numbers of persons with behavioral health problems, mental illness, substance abuse, are accumulating inside correctional institutions. I'm the corrections director from the state of Rhode Island. We're a full-service adult correctional agency. We're responsible not only for the state's prisons, but also its jails, its probation, and its parole services. So if you're 18 years of age or older or a juvenile waived into the system, we're responsible across all those dimensions. And it has required a real adjustment in our thinking over the years. I mean, I got my start at the line level of corrections 37 years ago, and at that time and for many years afterwards, we looked at our population as sort of the product of the criminal mind. And increasingly, what we've come to see are people whose criminal behavior is now more a public health issue or the product of disease. And that is a different model than what we were accustomed to over the years. And one of the reasons that they accumulate is, of course, we have an ironclad no refusal policy. We're the only institution in civil society that can never say no. And so when somebody is causing consternation on the streets, or a judge has no sense of where, what to do with this individual, well, we're considered at least a safe place. Some of those folks do well in our system. The structure works for them. They're compliant. They're participating in interactions with their clinicians. But for many, it doesn't work. The fact is, we operate on a rational model. There are rules. We tell you the rules. We assume you understand the rules and that you will comply with them. And if you don't, there are consequences. And you know there are consequences. That doesn't fit the new inmate. And so increasingly, we have found that we need to adopt a community-based approach, both within the prison and outside of it. This is not our area of expertise in corrections. Our area of expertise is custody, security, programming, but not necessarily the kinds of public health questions that arise here.
So hopefully you're meeting lots of people here who will help you.
Well, yes, it's very nice to be in this audience, and I do think my profession does need to be part of these kinds of conversations. In any event, we have a community mental health system in Rhode Island that I think is unusually responsible and responsive to the needs of the correction system in that population. And we have contractual relationships with virtually every community mental health center in the state. When someone hits our doors, that same day, we email out a list of new commitments to the Department of Behavioral Health, Developmental Disabilities Hospitals. In fact, Craig Stenning, my counterpart, is here in the audience. Craig, you're a wonderful partner, and this is just one of those ways. And they, in turn, email it out to every community mental health center in the state, which then matches it against its own rosters and communicates with us what they know about the people who have come in. They are not actually coming in to provide individual therapy, in part because Medicaid doesn't pay for those hours when someone's in prison. But they are providing numerous programs and helping us with discharge planning. We make sure that somebody who is seriously mentally ill does not leave without a connection to a community mental health center. Inside the walls, increasingly a sense that this is a community that needs support, and the model of recovery has taken hold. The contracts we have are, it used to be you take the program, you complete the program, somehow you're sort of cured. Now we recognize that it's an ongoing process, that those programs are the gateway, and that the community of people who are in those programs and have become part of those programs becomes our community of recovery. And I am proud to say that we are, to my knowledge, the only correctional system in the nation which participates in Recovery Month to the extent that we have recovery rallies in our institutions behind the walls. So many things to say, limited amount of time, but that gives you some sense of kind of how we see our responsibility, what its limits are, and what we can do.
And Iti, one quick follow-up. How has technology, since it's something that Steve alluded to, changed how you think of community, facilitating community or enabling community support for your inmates, if at all?
It's a difficult issue for us because with technology come modems, and with modems come mischief. And we are a very risk-averse culture. In addition, there's almost zero tolerance for something going awry when someone is in prison. The public doesn't accept it. And so lowest common denominator is that in virtually every correctional system, any use of computers, for example, is a closed system, doesn't connect to the world outside. We know that technology is sort of marching forward, and we're going to have to figure it out. But right now, we're probably the exception to what I suspect would be a much more robust use of technology in, say, Paul's domain.
Paul, do you want to pick up from that
Sure,
segue? I
sure.
mean, I couldn't, and please share the statistic that you shared with us earlier.
Yeah, maybe first off, thank you for having me here, and Chelsea, thank you for your leadership. So I come from a big, distant, and sometimes intimidating community. I'm a Yankees fan. So being here today...
They should feel generous.
Yeah, so I
after
want to
the
thank
win
you
last night.
for making me feel welcome here and making me feel welcome last night.
We feel sorry for this.
Well, you know, I'm going to hold the Yankee talk for today, but it's really exciting for me to be a part of this broader mental health community as a veteran. So I served in Iraq, and I came home in 2004. And when I came home in 2004, there was no Iraq and Afghanistan veterans community. And I remember it was about 9 years ago, I was on a stage like this talking about what was happening in Iraq. And at that time, people hadn't actually heard from people who had been on the ground, who could explain what Iraq and Afghanistan was like. And I was at an event in Washington, and a man who's here today walked up to me, a man named Wayne Smith, who's to my left, who's a dear friend and a mentor and a real trailblazer for the veterans community and has been for decades. And he walked up to me and he said, you know, welcome home, brother. I'm a Vietnam vet. And it was the first time that had really happened to me. And I didn't realize I was a part of a community. I didn't realize there was this history of a larger community. And Wayne has been such an important voice for especially the Vietnam veterans of that community. But taking a step back, there are over 20 million combat veterans in the United States of all generations. For Iraq and Afghanistan, it's about 2.5 million. And it might be helpful for me to give you a little bit of background of what they look like and what they think about. But our average member is about 28 years old. 15% are women. About 25 or 30% are in school. Many of them are married. They're not just 19-year-old draftees like in previous generations. Geographically, they're much more spread out because so many National Guard and Reserve units have been activated. They're not all just at a place like Fort Bragg. And now they're re-entering communities all across the country, not just because they're retiring or getting out of the military, but because they're going to school. About 1 million of them are using the GI Bill, so thousands are here in Boston and all across the country re-entering the broader community. And the message that we want to communicate is that this represents a great generation of leaders. They can be America's next greatest generation, but they are an important component of this broader mental health community. I think probably the most shocking statistic is that we lose 22 veterans every day to suicide. Active duty and veterans of this generation, we are losing more veterans to suicide than to Al-Qaeda and the Taliban combined. We're losing more people to suicide than to the enemy. That's the urgency of what we're dealing with every day. And I represent a nonprofit organization, IAVA, with the largest community of these folks. We've got about 200,000 members around the country. And for us, community comes in a variety of forms. It's often dictated by a commonality of experience. It could be the unit you served in. It could be that you're a woman veteran. It could be that you lost your leg. But community transcends geographic restrictions. It transcends the walls even of a prison. And it's often online. So our folks have our Facebook page, I believe, has over 400,000 folks connected to it. That's more than the DoD, Department of Defense, and the VA combined. So what that means is community for us is not defined by geography. And what's happening is, in the old days, you had a Veterans Hall. And vets would get together and tell war stories and wear funny hats and drink beer. But they were connected. They had this sense of community. And that's the beauty of what the Veterans Halls did. Now we have the internet. So we are the next generation of the Veterans Hall. And we're using that community to connect them with each other, which is very important, and connecting them with programs and resources. So all of our programs are based on an acronym. We're military people. We love acronyms. It's HEAC, Health, Education, Employment, and Community. And community is kind of the secret sauce. Because if you can't get them together and get them to be a part of a broader community, you can forget about trying to get them PTSD resources or anything else. So we can't just have PTSD Day down in Copley Square and expect everybody to come down. But we can have a screening of a film. We can go to a Red Sox game. We can have a history forum. We can get together as a community and then use that as an opportunity to plug in the best-in-class resources, many of which you all represent. So, the thing that I want to communicate is that we need your community, but we are also already a part of your community. We're in the prisons, we're in the homeless shelters, we're in the universities, but we're tougher to understand and to connect with on a visceral level than ever before, because although we're 2.5 million people, we're less than 0.5% of the overall population. In World War II, it was about 12%. So everybody in this room in World War II would have a family member, would have someone that you worked with who had been overseas and had come home. So we've really got to help identify this community, support this community, and open up this community. Because what I felt when I came home in 2004, and sometimes when I come to Boston as a Yankees fan, is isolation. And a good friend of mine who's a psychiatrist said, and I'm not an expert, but I've got a lot of on-the-job training over the last 10 years. I said, how do we get to suicide? And he said, connection and hope. And that's what our community is looking for. And what I often try to communicate is that the problem is the solution. The veterans are not a victim. They're not a problem. They are a resource and a potential leadership pool that can be a great generation of reform and can take this mental health community and our country to a much higher level. So I also just want to say before I wrap up, Patrick Kennedy has been such an incredible leader for us. When we were starting out in 2004, a lot of folks in Washington didn't want to meet with Iraq and Afghanistan veterans for a variety of different reasons. He was one of the first people to open up his doors. And he was behind veterans long before it was cool. And he helped us pass the Lane Evans mental health bill. He helped us pass the Joshua Ombig Suicide Prevention Act, which created the Veterans Crisis Line, which right now is serving veterans right now, and was thankfully one of the components of VA that was not shut down during the shutdown. And that was because of the hard work of Patrick and a few other select advocates who saw what was coming and were proactive and really showed some tremendous leadership.
Thank you, Paul. What do you think the VA and the DoD should be doing, not only to kind of acquire more Facebook fans, but more profoundly to support our men and women who are serving, our men and women who are veterans, and particularly their families, who I think too often are left out of the conversation?
DoD and VA are big dogs in our space. Right? And the way I would frame it is, the veteran is a hub in the middle of a number of spokes. And this is where a community like Boston is so critical, because it's DoD, it's VA, it's also private local foundations, it's soup kitchens, it's the Red Sox and Mass General with their fantastic home base program. It's people like Coleman Nee, who is the leader of the Veterans Department here for the Commonwealth, and I think is the most brilliant state leader in the country. He's doing incredible things. They've all got to work together around that veteran and understand that some folks aren't going to go to the VA. Only about 53% of my generation actually access VA care. So for DoD, I think the most important thing they can do is try to connect their pipeline, which is people leaving the military, into the broader network of services and communities. They're not doing a great job of that right now. They're working on improving it. But when they come out of DoD, they kind of fall off the edge of the table. And then it becomes 52 pickup. The VA picks up some of them, we pick up some of them, universities pick up some of them, but there's not a seamless pipeline into a supportive community coming out. For the VA, they've made tremendous progress. To put it bluntly, they've got to deliver. In some ways, they're like the Obamacare website. And I hate to say it, I know it's a touchy subject, but lots of veterans are bouncing off They're coming in there and they're stepping forward and they want to take advantage of the resources and the programs that are available to them, and VA can't always deliver. So they've got to be able to execute at a high level. Right now, the VA disability claims backlog is close to 500,000 people. And that means, hundreds of thousands of people are waiting sometimes a year to have their disability claims processed. So, that's an execution challenge. They've got to be able to move the paperwork.
10.5 months is the average at the moment.
Yeah. So I think those are two areas. And most importantly, for both of them, they've got to work with you all better. They've got to turn their bureaucracies inside out and reform, especially around issues like women's care, military sexual trauma, traumatic brain injury, the new stuff that really has caught them flat-footed. And I think they're moving forward, but they've got to innovate. And that's a real cultural transformation, especially at the VA, that's got to be accelerated.
Thank you. Elaine, you work with communities throughout California to try to ensure that these connections happen and that there actually is a community approach from a community and that it's not just sort of a disparate choreography. Can you talk about how you try to encourage and support that productive and sustainable collaboration?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for having me here today. My name is Elaine Ablay Mateo, and as Chelsea mentioned, I've been involved in some work that's really trying to elevate the community perspective and the broader community dialogue about mental health kind of up through the ranks to develop some strategies towards addressing more effective mental health systems in local communities. So I'm part of an effort called Creating Community Solutions. And it's a very innovative initiative that basically takes a number of different stakeholders, from elected officials, community-based organizations, faith-based leaders, and the general population, particularly young people, particularly people under the age of 24, and brings them together to have a dialogue, to put mental health on the table and to have a discussion about what it means to have strong mental health programs and services in their local communities. I'm from Sacramento, and I had the pleasure of engaging in the outreach work in Sacramento and continuing on to work on some of the action planning and the strategy development. And to use Sacramento as an example, we had a number of elected officials who came to the table to help kind of show leadership on this issue. I'll mention some of them because they've been such great champions. Congresswoman Matsui, our mayor, Kevin Johnson, California State Senator Darrell Steinberg, who's been a huge champion of mental health programs and services and resources out in Sacramento, and Assembly Member Roger Dickinson. So we had this cohort of elected officials. We had a number of systems leaders, our local school districts, county officials, mental health departments.
Did you have a veterans representative?
We certainly did. We absolutely did.
I didn't know what the answer was going to be, but I'm glad it was that one.
We absolutely did.
Pass the test.
And we also had folks from juvenile justice department as well. And so we had a number of different systems leaders, and we had local philanthropy. This is really important. So we had foundations, 4 of them, in fact. The Sierra Health Foundation, the California Endowment, Blue Shield, and the California Wellness Foundation, each of whom stepped up and have said, they're committing resources. After this day of dialogue, we're basically going to put up funding to support an action plan. And the action plan is going to support 12 to 18-month implementation of these community strategies that are developed. So we had the elected officials, systems leaders, and we had 350 community members come to have a dialogue on July 20th in Sacramento. And 100 of those, over 100 of those, were young people under the age of 24. And so when you talk about community work, what's particularly innovative about creating community solutions is it's doing just that, bringing community to the table, talking about strategies to create more effective mental health services and programs. And then as a follow-up to that, taking local resources and rolling out an action plan. And so it's very good work. It's brought community members who have historically been very marginalized. We had 5 different languages. We had interpreters, translators in 5 different languages. When we did the outreach, we developed flyers for the general community. But in some communities, particularly ethnic communities and monolingual communities, this concept of mental health doesn't exist. So what we did was we talked about, we had to kind of bring it down a little. Do you feel sad? Do you ever feel angry? Do you ever feel excessively tired? So what are some things that will resonate to bring them to the table? Because community is broad, and especially in Sacramento, it's a very diverse city. But we really made efforts to make this conversation accessible to everybody. And Sacramento is just one model, or just one place where this is happening. These conversations are taking place all over the country. Albuquerque, D.C., and young people are stepping up and showing leadership. They're decision makers at the table. In D.C., following their day of dialogue, they've convened an action planning committee. 6 youth are part of that committee. They're equal decision makers at the table. And I think that's integrally important as we look forward and thinking about community mental health. The community, they know what they need. And so I think coming together and bringing multiple stakeholders to the table, we can really do some innovative things and take community mental health to the next level.
Great, thank you. Steve, picking up on what Elaine was talking about, that communities often do know what they need, and not only to get the bad language off the streets, but on a basic sort of services level. What do you think is the appropriate role of the federal government, not only to make sure healthcare.gov is working well, and sort of the state government, as well as foundations and civil society organizations like Paul? I mean, what would good look like in your estimation? How do we fulfill President Kennedy's vision, not from 1963's perspective, but from 2013's perspective, but with the same ethos?
Well, the 1963 legislation set a precedent that we need federal leadership. And that, of course, is controversial because we have a whole segment of our politics that says that the less government, the better. And for many years after President Franklin Pierce vetoed Dorothea Dix's bill that would have provided federal leadership for humane care for the insane, as they were called in the 19th century, everything went to the states, and then that began to be reversed. We need federal leadership to bring together a variety of constituencies or communities to think about what they need to do to have synergy in the programming that they have, whether it's veterans or it's those with disabilities, or we need to have a way of bringing together all the federal programs. We need to have innovation from the federal government. One of the best aspects, I think, of the Affordable Care Act are the innovation grants that are being implemented across the country. There are only a few in mental health area, but there are a few. And the idea that there are different ways of bringing various communities together at the local level with some federal funding and federal thinking that goes into that, I think, is very important. One program, when I was at the NIMH, and I was director of the Mental Health Centers program, that we put together was a community support program, a small grant program that was designed to energize state government to provide more community resources, more mental health services in local communities, and be less focused on the institutions. I thought it was a very successful program, and it was, I think, important that there was federal leadership in order to be able to do that. So federal leadership is, I think, an essential aspect of where we need to go into the future. It started with 1963, and President Kennedy saying we need federal leadership, and the NIMH, which had up to that point was mostly a research part of the NIH, had that leadership in providing services. Now it's SAMHSA that has that responsibility.
A.T., how much of community is there among your peers at the state level across the country, and how much are you talking about questions like we're discussing on this stage today, but also more broadly kind of throughout these couple of days?
There is a professional association of the state correctional administrators. I happen to be the current president, in fact. And
So you're ensuring this is on the agenda.
yes. It's a pretty exclusive club. There are only 50 of us, and the Justice Department brings us together routinely on the quite sensible assumption that maybe we should have some professional development and some networking if we're going to do these jobs. And the issue of people with behavioral health issues, certainly mental health, is very much on our agenda now for a couple of reasons. One, because we have seen an influx of people that require us to think differently than we traditionally have. And we've recognized that it's not a problem we can solve ourselves. We need to have connections to people more credible than we are in that area, namely community-based providers, services, people with expertise in mental health. The second is because mentally ill inmates are significantly overrepresented in the deepest end of the correctional system, the so-called supermax facilities, administrative segregation. And that's in part because they become difficult to manage when you are trying to deal with large numbers of people. They do have trouble following the rules. They can't necessarily sort of correct themselves, as it were, so they languish where they decompensate further. And that's come to the attention of advocates. And some of you may know that there's really a great deal of interest now across the country in what prison systems are doing with those mentally ill inmates who are in administrative segregation. So that has also led to, it's captured our attention because, frankly, we're being sued.
And A.T., are there, you talked about some of the work that you're doing in Rhode Island, particularly in providing kind of off-boarding plans for your inmates when they're getting out and making those connections. Are there other innovations like that that you see happening around the country, particularly for inmates who are struggling with mental illness or recovering addicts?
I think that the concept of prisoner reentry has been a great gift to the corrections profession because it's allowed us to reclaim our mission, that it's not just about security, custody, housing people. We need to recognize that with virtually no exceptions, everybody will be released. And that has also depoliticized it and made it a bipartisan issue, one of the few that I can see, because the case is pretty self-evident. You don't have to like it. You don't have to agree with it. I may not like it, and I may not agree with it, but that guy is getting out. That decision has been made. So now what are we going to do to make the best of it? And I think that has been a very, at the federal level, there's been a great deal of activity in sort of promoting safe prisoner reentry. And certainly with regard to this population, lots of activity in for example, we have specific discharge planners who are dedicated to seriously mentally ill inmates. They understand that work. They have those connections.
There's a real specialty there.
Yeah, absolutely. And so if you are really sort of deep-end mentally ill, for example, you will be given a specialized plan to a community mental health center. We have enjoyed great partnership with the advocates and with those who are responsible for substance abuse and mental health. Some of you may be familiar with the Access to Recovery grants that the federal government provides. They're sort of the services that surround the treatment, housing, support, peer support, things like that. That's another instance of the kind of thing that's taking place around the country. Many others, but I will say that certainly there is no sense that anymore that there's the walls of the correctional institutions, there's the community, and the two do not intersect. It's getting far more porous than that with regard to returning inmates.
Elaine, who was not in the conversation in Sacramento? I mean, there were 300 some odd people there, so maybe everyone. But were there constituents either kind of because of political reasons or otherwise who weren't part of that dialogue, who you wish had been there, who you hope will be included in the future?
That's a good question. You know, I think that, like I said, we had 350 people who participated in the dialogue that day. We had 100 young people. But I think that we could have had more. I think that youth voice potentially could have been stronger and should be stronger if we're going to move forward and develop programs and services to better support them, because obviously they're one of the most vulnerable populations when it comes to mental health services and programs. But I think that overall, I was in charge of the outreach, so I think that we really strive to look very broadly across multiple stakeholders and ensure that folks knew about the conversation and could be part of it. I think that in terms of who was in the room, I think we had a good cross spectrum of voices to really represent, and from that day collect data that would help drive some strong recommendations and action plans to do some things differently and more effectively in Sacramento. And I think that's, like I said, Sacramento is one example. It's happening all across the country.
Well, the 47% of combat veterans who do not go to the VA, are they receiving the attention, support, care that they need from institutions, in Boston, in rural areas, and everywhere across the country?
The short answer is no.
And I would argue, how do we get to yes?
Yeah, and I would argue that a lot of the 53% who are accessing VA care aren't really being served well enough either. I actually would love to answer the last question that you asked Elaine. I mean, the folks who are missing from our conversation, what's missing from our conversation is the public. You all know this. You work in the mental health space. If you work in government, you know this. If you work at the VA or the Pentagon, you know this. And Patrick said, I think very importantly last night, that the mental health fight is going to be one of the most important civil rights fights of our time. I think that's right. And I think the after effects of 10 years of war will be one of the biggest public health challenges of our time. And I don't think the public is really tracking on that yet. And we're not somebody else's problem. We try to find a historical parallel for this public health challenge. And we think back to AIDS 30 years ago. You had this huge explosion of public health demand. The government was struggling to catch up. You had no research. You had no metrics for efficacy. You had a sprawling startup space of nonprofits. Philanthropy didn't really understand it. And most of all, people thought AIDS was a gay problem. People think veterans are a government problem. And until we break that down and really galvanize the country behind what is truly an epic public health challenge, I think we're going to be struggling to catch up. So the public has not been engaged. And the way I would frame it is, we're all in this fight every day to care for our veterans and to provide the runway for them to succeed. But we are really outgunned and outnumbered. And we don't have any beans and bullets for the fight ahead. Philanthropy has been woefully slow and small in their response. I think you all at CGI have finally jump-started this thought leadership space that really needed to happen. But at the end of the day, most of the groups in this space are underfunded. They don't have the critical internal support and operational support, and there's no path to scale. So if you have a great program here in Boston that's delivering on mental health and you want to scale it nationwide, you can work on the VA and trying to get them on board. That might take a decade. In the meantime, folks are committing suicide. So Boston is actually a great laboratory right now because you've got so many of these amazing players with the state team and Coleman Knee and the Red Sox and the VA and private locally based veterans groups and nonprofits. It's turning into a really promising laboratory, actually. But it's because there is a call to action to the public. I don't think it's high enough yet, but I think until we get that, we're going to be really struggling to catch up.
And we also need to highlight then work like what's happening in Boston.
Yeah.
Not only to ensure that there can be more resources rewarded to success, but so that it can inspire other communities to respond.
And it's ripe for innovation. I mean, Patrick talked about all the science breakthroughs that can happen if we tackle this. The mental health community, I think, embraced us early because they understood the profound connection we have with the American people. They know that we're an example of where stigma is really a huge problem. And veterans are starting to explain and understand that if you have a mental health injury, you've got to treat it like a bullet wound. And you've got to tackle it, and you've got to be aggressive in your treatment, and you can get back in the fight, and you can lead a productive life. But until we get the level of innovation and acceleration and scale that we need, I think it's going to be a real challenge. I mean, we have caseworkers. Our program director, Kate Horner, is over there, and she's brilliant. We've developed a caseworker team that we call RIP, the Rapid Response Referral Program. What they're doing essentially is patient navigation, because veterans have so many things out there, they don't know where the hell to start. So what they need is someone who can help guide them through it, and we call it RIP because it rips through the bureaucracy. And what they're able to do now is we have folks who are social workers, but are also kind of like a Zappos customer service rep, because they can solve your problem, and they can do suicide interventions on Twitter. And that's the forward edge of where I think we can help not just our community, but the broader mental health community.
I want to open it up to questions, but I also know Steve has a response.
Just in terms of bureaucratic problems, we have a traumatic brain injury program in my hospital health system in Baltimore. And there's a big VA. We've tried to open it up to veterans. And we've reached out to the VA, and the VA says, no, we can take care of it. We can take care of it. And we don't think they can. But, I think that's a problem.
Why don't we start here in the center?
Yes. Is this on? Can people hear me?
Nope.
I can sign language.
Now we can hear you.
Okay, thanks. Hi. I've been working many years making documentaries to be screened, PBS and whatnot, to increase compassion so we can get more people to the table around mental illness. And I'm particularly interested in the fact that there's one key that no one really talks about, and that is getting curriculum into schools to teach about mental health and mental illness. And as I screen my films in schools globally, the interest of students to not just do mental health and the bullying, which is a little bit, but really even the mental illness is really a key to increasing compassion. And yet we never, ever talk about that. And I've just wondered, Chelsea, you think broadly about schools. Let me just say one last point. It's that my understanding is that sex ed came in because after World War II, STDs and whatnot got it a public health issue. And then bullying through, it's gotten a little bit of a federal mandate for that. So I just wondered. Thank you.
Sure. Let's actually take a few questions because, gosh, there are so many people standing in line. Why don't we go over here, and then we'll try to answer them collectively.
Where was that on button?
Or you can shout.
Is it on? You can hear me? I'm Christy Barber from Connecticut. I'm actually housed at the CVH campus, Connecticut Valley Hospital campus, and we do advocacy and education for mental health conditions. So I just wanted to mention about language. I think it's really important as we look at how we talk about people who have mental health conditions. There's a continuum. So you might have a mild mental health condition or a severe mental health condition. So when I hear the mentally ill, it gets me, and some of the people around me are like, oh, the mentally ill. Because that, and the insane asylum, all the terms, we still use them today, and you don't want to just trip over it and have to be publicly correct but it really is important when you say the mentally ill, or it would be like saying, do you say when somebody has that physical condition, the physically ill? You don't want to be known as your mental health condition. So just as we go forward, just as an advocacy point, and I like mental health conditions. Other people have different things that they like in terms of what to say, but just want to make that as an awareness.
Sure. Thank you. Over here.
Yes, I'd be very interested in some comments from the panel. I'm Dr. Alan Goodwin from Florida, New York. And if I go back to the community mental health days where we could do things pretty spontaneously, start a day school with the local school district, work with the county jail to do groups in the jail. Then I fast forward to today and 400 child care centers in New York City trying to get parent and teacher consultations from mental health entities through video conferencing or any other sort of process. And the struggle to get people working together. It just seems so much more difficult to really get a service entity here working with a service entity there. talk about integrated health care and obesity and mental health. You look at a parent who's depressed. How can you have good health management of asthmatics or diabetics from a parent severely depressed or schizophrenic? So I guess it does. The theme of this session today, working together, I'm not sure we're working together. It's all about the Medicaid billing. Can you get reimbursement? Can you get this? And people really don't come together. So I'd be interested in the thoughts of the panel.
Sure. Does someone want to talk about how you think we're not working together, but hopefully are moving towards working more together? I think that's one of the themes that we've heard on the panel. And the importance of language. Does anyone want to respond to the first sort of three questions, and then I can talk about the schools briefly?
Sure, I'll take a stab at his comment. Yeah, getting people working together. It is very resource intensive. I think all of us who are in this work, working across multiple sectors, working in community, I mean, make no mistake, if you're really interested in working and partnering with community and taking a community approach to mental health, it is resource intensive, from funding to people power to developing. I mean, a lot of it is building from the ground up. But there are strategies. You've heard some of them today. But I don't have a solution to that other than we have to try, though, because if we don't, I mean, the challenges are amongst us, right? So I think that even though it's resource intensive, it is worth making the effort to work across systems, across sectors, and de-siloing. And
hopefully meetings like this help.
Absolutely.
Steve?
I'm actually optimistic in terms of the ways we are working together. We are working together, I think, much better. And let me give you an example that kind of answers all three questions. In schools, we have a program in Maryland, and it is elsewhere, called Positive Behavior Intervention Support, which is a mental health program that tries to make schools safer and more open and less punitive, and introduce concepts of mental health to teachers and to students. Very carefully, we try to manage the language. Just the term positive behavior intervention support gives you a sense of what that's all about. And so I think there's optimism. Again, these are programs in which educators and psychologists, very interdisciplinary, go into schools. They're welcomed by the schools. We are now in 950 schools in the state of Maryland. And I think that kind of activity in the state, the catchment area for my hospital is Maryland. And we try to, do these things in the context of working with each other. And, I don't think that would have happened 50 years ago.
And just briefly on the schools point, the Common Core, which will start next year in the vast majority of states, is focused on math and literacy, largely. And there are plans for science to be incorporated. But there are no plans to be incorporated subjects like civics, which is currently only taught in 11 states. Right? And I think that, for example, is a big challenge, that we're no longer teaching kids about how our government works, and that if they're really passionate about something, whether they should be protesting at City Hall or writing their congressperson or
tweeting at the president.
And something else that's not in the pipeline is health, largely because of a concern about having to tackle sex ed. But unfortunately, that then means that all sorts of other parts of the conversation are ignored as well. Like, what is a healthy body image? What is a healthy weight? Like, what is a healthy diet? Kids don't know these things. When I was in public school in Little Rock, I had sex ed in 7th grade, but I also had Nifty Nutrition from kindergarten until I left in 8th grade. And Nifty Nutrition was the cartoon character who taught me about nutrition, and also taught me about, how to run properly. And Nifty was quite nifty. And, there's nothing like that in the pipeline for the Common Core. And so if this is something you're really passionate about, or for people who really think that we need to be educating young people about how our bodies work, about how maybe when they're not working, what resources we should access so that we can feel better about ourselves and get healthier, and also how to navigate our quite complicated federal system as citizens. I'm trying to help on the last part. I hope that maybe some of you will try to help on the other parts. Let's take another round of questions. We'll start in the center again and maybe get even more this time.
My name is Gary Blumenthal, and I live and work in Massachusetts, and I'm also a member of the National Council on Disability. And Chelsea, I worked in your father's administration as the director of the President's Committee on Mental Retardation, and I'm looking forward to your mother's administration.
We almost made a whole panel without...
Because frankly, I think with your mother's administration, we'll have another era to celebrate. But I want to ask you all and ask the panel, how can you maintain hope when you look at state budgets and you see that with respect to disability programs, to developmental disability programs, to psychiatric disability programs, that there are investments are not being made, that during the recession, these programs were pummeled, when we really don't have that many leaders. While I have the greatest respect for Director here on behalf of the Corrections Department, the fact that the Corrections Department is the largest provider of psychiatric disability services in many communities is a real statement about investments from state government. So does your optimism stay with you, or is it out the window when you look at states?
Why don't we take another question from...
My name is Wayne Smith, and I am Paul's bigger brother, if you will. But when
awesome.
we met...
awesome. Talk about positivity. He's one of the most positive, awesome people on the planet, period.
Sorry,
go ahead, man.
You got to stop. I'm blushing.
It's so bright, I can't even see you blushing. But now I want to see you blushing, so I'll cover the light.
But when we met 9 years ago, and I looked in Paul's eye, I saw virtually myself. And after spending 18 months in Vietnam as a combat medic, I came home with full-blown PTSD, before PTSD was a diagnosis, of course. And I ended up in the ACI that Director Walls is warden of. And it was a tragic accident, but I spent 3 years in prison. And I was kind of a personification in some ways of the themes we're talking about. The VA could not help me, and they said they couldn't help me. But it was a community organization, Kodak, that really kind of reached out to me, and I got involved in an education program and with other veterans. To align myself with what Paul is saying is so absolutely true, because the perception is that the VA will take care of veterans. But I came from the community. I really wanted nothing to do with the VA, and yet we were able to, as veterans, to bond and to overcome enormous issues. So I just want to say that I'm really not the kind of person that Paul is saying. I'm just another vet, just another fellow who happened to have been lucky and happened to have been connected to some good people that gave me the opportunity where I was able to work with your father, Chelsea, on normalizing relations with Vietnam and promoting other good legislation. So it's just not that uncommon. I really am not. There are lots of us, but we just need the opportunity to go back to the communities where we came from, to dig in, bond, and we can get this done. Thanks.
Thank you. Over here.
Jeffrey Geller from the University of Massachusetts. I want to express a concern that we are overly focused on what we think we're doing that's new, rather than paying attention to the fact that we've known most of what we think is new a long time ago, and we need to pay attention to the follow-through. Ms. Clinton, in response to your interest in history, I want to point out what we knew before 1875. We knew that people living in the community had stressors that derived from the community that related to their mental illness. We knew that the purpose of organized psychiatry, including state hospitals, was to ameliorate symptoms, provide rehabilitation, get people back to the community, and get them back to work. We knew that war caused psychiatric casualties. We learned that in the Civil War. We knew that people with mental illness die substantially younger than people who do not have mental illness. Edward Jarvis pointed that out in Massachusetts in the 1860s. We knew that families can escalate or ameliorate symptoms. We knew that leisure and recreation were important for mental health. We knew, as Steve pointed out earlier, that a president can defeat sweeping reform. We knew that peers are important providers, and we knew that people with mental illness recover. We knew all of that. What we didn't do was follow through, and my concern is we're not following through now. The number of people who have unfettered access to the community, that is people in institutions, is the same now as the number of people in state and county hospitals in 1955, which is the highest peak year-end census, adjusted for population, exactly the same. They're just in different institutions. It's not what's new. It's the follow-through. Thank you.
So I think those two questions actually couple well together. Are you optimistic? And if you're not, are you not optimistic because there isn't sufficient follow-through? And unfortunately, I see the white rectangle at the back that is the sign that we're almost out of time. So I have to ask each of you to be brief, and then I hope those of you that did not get to ask your questions from the microphones will find our panelists afterward to help continue to build this community. But please, Steve, we'll start with you.
At Shepherd Pratt in Baltimore and throughout Maryland, we have now 1,200 individuals who live with us in group homes, supervised apartments, and halfway houses, a variety of supported living arrangements. They have supported employment. All these individuals, and I know a number of them, would have been in the state hospital except for some of the policies that derive out of the 1963 Act. So I think that that's very positive. Now, at the same time, we have these 1,200 folks in the community, and with a life in the community, there are lots of folks in the jails, and there are lots of folks who are homeless.
So are you optimistic, yes or no?
I think the glass is half full.
Half full. Optimistic.
Paul?
I'm optimistic. My mother reminded me last year that my blood type is B positive. It's corny, but we had a really.
I'm B positive too.
We had a challenging.
That is where I get my optimism.
There we go. See,
I never knew that.
We're hardwired
Learn
to
something
be positive,
new every day.
right? But we have had a rough year in our community. We're losing a lot of people, and it's hard. We deal in a business that involves a lot of death and destruction, and we've got to have a positive attitude. And we're also, I think, I'm hardwired for it. I think our community's hardwired for it. I think our country is hardwired for it. And just to go back to 2 points earlier, one, the language is important. We say mental health injuries. There's a huge debate right now about whether or not to drop the D from PTSD in the DSM. So that's an important conversation as well, especially in dealing with stigma, especially with younger populations. So I think that's an important one. But I think we are collaborating, and that gives us reason to be positive. But you can't have real collaboration without authority or incentive. And I think a lot of folks are telling us, hey, work together and find the money on your own, or work together and just go to the Pentagon and get them to help you. There has to be a real conversation about the resources. When I went to a war in Iraq in 2004, we had no body armor, and we had crappy Humvees that wouldn't stop anything. You shouldn't send folks into a battle without being properly resourced, and I think right now this is a group of people who are at the forefront of a very important battle, and we need to have a real conversation in this country about how we're under-resourced.
A.T.?
I'm optimistic. I think that our field is better connected to those who can support our mission than we ever have been before. I think that there is a real appreciation that we share populations in common. My congressman was Patrick Kennedy until he decided to leave office. But before him, the other congressman, his predecessor, once convened a meeting about mentally ill, and somehow or other I was invited, and he made it clear, now we're not really talking about your population, A.T. We're talking about the good mentally ill and the good substance abusers, not the ones who end up in the criminal justice system. That distinction has been erased. The fact is that there's a recognition that the people that we call offenders and inmates many of you call clients, consumers, family, and friends. But they are the same people. They're just coming through different doors. Social movements and trends ebb and flow. So things may get better and they may get worse. But right now it's our time. It's our watch. And I think it is our job to make the best of this moment and work together as a large community to move the ball forward while we still have it.
Elaine, optimistic?
Yeah, I'm absolutely optimistic. As part of the Creating Community Solutions work in Sacramento, we worked with a group of young people, the Sacramento Building Healthy Communities Youth Media Team. And what they did is they developed a series of vignettes and stories to help share mental health information, education, peer-to-peer. And what was fantastic about this work is you have young people kind of telling their story to other young people. But the other kind of outcome, and this is another reason why I'm very optimistic about this work, is it normalized the conversation for them, and a number of them realized they needed some connection to some mental health services and programs. So I'm very optimistic. And there's action planning that's coming alongside those dialogues. We have a website, creatingcommunitysolutions.org, where you can look up the tangible solutions that people in local communities are coming up with. So people are empowered. So I'm very optimistic about this work moving forward.
Great. So more work to do. Optimistic about getting it done, partly because all of us are in this room together.
Thank you to our panelists.
Thank you to all of you.